Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethan Fox. And if you are seeing any ads on our videos, including this one, feel free to scoot on over to Rumble, where you can watch us ad-free. We are also up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so you can check us out there as well. And unless you've been living under a rock for a very long period of time, you probably know that we're going through a very chaotic earthly transition here on the planet, including a split of timelines and truly a revisiting of ancient history that I think we're all here to work out. And lately, there's been a lot of questions in my inner circle community, and we've been exploring a lot of these topics on the channeled revelation shows that we get a lot of questions on as well. So we thought we'd tackle this topic in a podcast so that Ethan and I could explain exactly how we see this timeline shift in this period on Earth, especially how we see it unfolding over the next couple of years, and how we are personally preparing to smoothly sail through that in a very highly conscious way. So I think we need to preface this topic really at the highest level. For those of you who haven't watched the podcast or are privy to the channeling, and this has really been something that my guides have been harping on since before 2015, that right now we would be in the midst of a very chaotic timeline collision, meaning that we're revisiting some of the most prominent historic timelines that have taken humanity off track in terms of their divine blueprint, our ability to evolve and to actually move into higher and higher dimensions. Now, we didn't know how that was all going to play out, obviously, but over the last couple of years, we got a taste as to how some of that history is actually showing up in modern day times. And my guides talk a lot about reptilian influence, which is a huge topic in and of itself. And we have had some questions on this that, why would we come to Earth to experience something like this? Well, at the very beginning of Earth's history, I don't think we chose to actually have these experiences take shape, but not unlike anywhere throughout history and throughout the universe, there have been wars, there have been cataclysms. And so we're not only dealing with earthly history, but we're also dealing with the spiral of time, the Akashic records. Everything that has been created before becomes the foundation of what we will create in the future. So unfortunately, what this reptilian consciousness or influence has done is it's limited our ability to actually work within the purity of our genetic template and to live on a planet without interference as well. So many of those things, Ethan's done a brilliant job of going back and having the guides address in a very sequential way as to what we're experiencing today. And I can say personally, from my perspective, and I've said this before, we're really seeing that reptilian influence pretty obviously at the ground level. And I don't want to start out on a negative note, but I think that has to be addressed when we're looking at the same themes of genetic modification, artificial intelligence, malevolent technologies that are still attempting to lower our consciousness and suppress our vibration. For example, many of you who tune into these podcasts understand the current tug of war that we have going on with the World Economic Forum, which in my mind has a lot to do with global consolidation of power versus decentralization and the power coming back to the people, which I know is also showing up in the astrological influences as well.
Right. And, we've talked about this numerous times on previous shows about the cycles that are happening now and how it's a repeat of cycles that have happened in the past when similar events occurred. So, as we've entered Pluto and Aquarius, we're seeing It's not obvious to maybe a lot of people. I mean, some people are probably more focused on one end than the other, meaning some people may be noticing more of the dystopian control systems that are in place, like the World Economic Forum, while other people are seeing the more positive, progressive, like consciousness expansion and things like that, or even some beneficial technological innovations that are happening in the world, which are positive aspects of Pluto and Aquarius. So we're going to see both. As Pluto enters Aquarius, we're going to see both. And meaning we're going to see the control systems escalating in this decade until, I would say, until the end of this decade, till about 2033, we're going to see those things escalating. And although a lot of people are not paying attention to these things, I pay attention to what's happening on both sides. So I notice what's happening in the physical third dimensional world, which we're still, most of us are still walking in that world. Even though we may not be living in that world, we still are affected by the things that are happening in that world to the extent that we're participating in mainstream society. Now, if you're not participating in mainstream society very much, then those things may not affect you. Maybe you're living on a property and you have plenty of money. Yeah, but even money is, if you're using conventional money, you're still being affected by what's happening in mainstream society. So you can't, as long as you're walking the earth right now, where we're walking between a third to a fifth dimension transition, there are going to be times when you're walking in a third dimension, or rather interfacing with third dimensional things such as money. And but you may live a very fifth dimensional existence otherwise. So there's going to be some of both. And so to some respect, we have to pay attention to both. And I think where a lot of the dystopian things that are happening in this decade and early part of next are really going to be on the third dimensional aspect, which is the financial control systems and other things like that. But meanwhile, the other side is also going to be moving forward, and pushing up against that, which is the move toward a freer society, which Pluto and Aquarius is much more freedom oriented. Pluto and Capricorn, which is Saturn, which we just left behind, but the influence still remains till the end of this decade, early next. So we're still seeing those old systems in place. And as in recent channel revelation shows, we talked about Saturn being attributed to Saturday or Saturn Day, or even satanic kind of things. So that sort of control system, the Saturn structures, governments, and institutions that are controlling the world, we would attribute to Pluto and Capricorn, which is now fading away. But while it's fading away, those influences still remain, and they'll continue to escalate. Meanwhile, they're losing power and influence. And I think you can already see that in this year, as an example, as Pluto entered Aquarius, we're starting to see a lot of those control systems failing. But meanwhile, they're ramping them up at the same time. So we're seeing even the next virus is coming out, but a lot more people don't buy into those things anymore. So the adoption isn't there to the same degree as was the case in the last decade, as Pluto was in Capricorn. So what we'll see in this decade is the control systems are going to struggle to stay in power, and they're going to lose control. Meanwhile, people will move more toward more freedom and more independence from these control systems. And as a result, the people in control are going to escalate their ability to control. And so we're going to see that push and pull of both sides as Pluto enters Aquarius. And in technology too, Aquarius is a very technology-oriented influence. So we will see huge innovations in technological advancement, but some of them are going to be part of the control system, like the artificial intelligence systems that are coming out today, and even a lot of the other more dystopian technologies, like the iris scanning technology that's going around now, where people are scanning their eyeballs to get free money. But at the same time, we're going to see huge innovations on the positive side as well. So both are going to coexist in this decade, and we're going to see advancements. And even there may be parts of AI that become positive, that become beneficial. For example, maybe we'll have AI technologies that will help to scan the human body and determine how to treat different illnesses in a way that the human mind can't do very efficiently. So there will be things like that AI could be used for in a positive way. But meanwhile, there will also be the dystopian aspects of it as well. So both elements will coexist in this decade. And then when we get to 2033 and beyond that, we're going to see the scales tipping. And as we've channeled in many shows about how the world in many respects has gone to one extreme. If you see it as a pendulum swings back and forth, and at each extreme, you'll see things on the earth at one extreme level of whatever that is. And then once it reaches that point, it unavoidably has to go to the other extreme. And now the last few years was one extreme, and now the pendulum is swinging to the other extreme. And as it does, those things that were extreme the last few years and really the last decade to 20 years are going to now swing to the middle, where they sort of neutralize between now and I would say early next decade. And then from there on, it'll swing to the opposite extreme, where much of what has been done the last 20 years is going to be undone. And it's going to look completely different, of course, because the world is moving in a different direction. But the extreme dystopian control systems will lead to extreme freedom and independence from these control systems. And I think that's what we see on the planet right now, is the availability of both for us to choose which one we want to, which areas we want to focus our energy. And so right now you can choose which extreme you want to, or which world you want to live in.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, is we have a split of timelines. And I really want to talk about that for a minute, because it can be very scary. And there are a lot of people, even channels, who are bringing in information about the new Earth and the split of timelines. And to me, we have two parallel timelines running here on planet Earth for sake of a collective type of model. We have a third dimensional timeline and we have a fifth dimensional timeline. And that wonky place in between is the fourth dimension, where we kind of keep going back and forth. We're bridging both worlds. We're trying to manage both of these different frequencies in our personal lives. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we face right now, is we can see what's possible, but the possibility of it hasn't come to full fruition. And then the third dimension is a very stagnant reality. And there's a reason for that, many reasons for that. So first I'll say, I don't think it's wrong to live in the third dimension. And I think the people who are choosing to live there are choosing, to their own preference. And we talked about it in the channeled revelations. You can be in a third dimensional reality and have very little density. You can be very happy there. But the problem is the third dimension has kind of been capped by this, we'll say, program that's been running that limits our free will. So when you're operating in the third dimension, it's the ability to see a spectrum of choices or opportunities that really is not available. There are certain societal rules you have to follow. There are government structures that are the norm. There's a way that we live and a way that we do things, and that cannot be broken. But some people simply can't live within the confines of that box anymore. So that's what consciousness does. It sort of breaks the mold of the box that we've been living in. We start considering that there are better and new ways to do things. So we're here to constantly evolve and improve, but the earth has been limited in its ability to do that. So many of us have awakened in consciousness to the degree that that fifth dimension actually became possible. But what happens when a new dimensional timeline is available is that we have to take everything that we knew before, all of those structures that we created and were upheld really through our vibration, and change them. And that is the breakdown of the third dimensional reality. So we think, well, things are breaking down. It's not fair. We've got this really malevolent history that we're dealing with. And all of that is true. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that we are the ones who are moving this shift forward. So if we hadn't grown or evolved to the point that we did, there would be no reason for the breakdown of a society. There'd be no reason for us to be questioning our educational models, our medical models, our financial institutions. We wouldn't even have any spiritual quest truly whatsoever. So we're learning more how to work with energy as opposed to working within the confines of solely a material reality. And so ultimately, this is good, even though we have to get from here to there. And that's the part that's truly so scary. So I want to address the question, and it comes up in so many of my courses and my different channel transmissions about two separate earths. And by no means am I trying to dog anyone who is stating this a different way. It's just the way that my guides have brought it into the channeling. I personally do not believe that the Earth is splitting into two separate planets, nor will we find ourselves in two completely different realities where people that have still chosen the third dimension are not going to be available to us. Now, to some degree, we already live in a reality where we are magnetizing the people that we are meant to be with. And those are both matching our vibration and some that we have soul contracts with to awaken. So I think we're always going to find ourselves in the midst of some people who don't necessarily see the world the same way we do, but we're meant to interface. And that glue is really the entire collective evolutionary contract that we've made with every other human soul on the planet, because we're all meant to be here together, pushing that envelope together. So I think it would be really hard from a rational standpoint to imagine the physical earth splitting into two separate realities, because to me, that is a cataclysm at its highest and best. And speaking of cataclysms, I want to also touch on that, because we've been talking a lot in the channeled revelations about the Great Flood period, for example. And this is brought into the book. If you're reading Epitayam, the guides bring the Great Flood period into the book as well. And I have been asked the question whether or not the guides think we're going to have another cataclysm like this, a Great Flood. And what the guides say, and what they actually brought through in the book, is that consciousness tends to take very massive events like that, like cataclysms of a mass scale, and break them down into smaller, more digestible events. So if we look at the spiral of time like a tornado, and the tornado is coming towards a mountain, we're the mountain. Those of us who have, advanced in consciousness, who are focused on the fifth dimension, we've kind of created this roadblock where that tornado is going to break apart and has to go around the mountain, and there's little fragments coming apart. And those little fragments are the mirrored events that might be similar to the Great Flood, but not as strong in their intensity. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, in some areas of the country, like Beijing, for example, where they are facing very detrimental weather events. But we have to keep in mind that this all goes back to the past and the malevolent history that we've experienced that brought us to where we are today. So looking at the world is not an easy thing to do these days, but I love how you said we have to keep both timelines in perspective. And if we do, I think we can find that balance to manage it in our personal lives very efficiently.
Yeah, I think we, as in the previous show, I talked about how we, even with the Schumann resonance as an example, we're trying to, now people who are 100% in the third dimension, they don't have these problems. Like, to them, the Schumann resonance is a scientific measurement and they don't understand fifth dimension to even bring that into the equation. So it's pretty straightforward and simple. But we are perceiving reality from the third dimension, flat perspective, and also from a higher perspective. And as a result, I think there's a lot of confusion about how those two work together. And that's why I think where all these confusions come from. And so we're trying to bring third dimension ideas fifth dimensional or higher perspective ideas into a third dimensional construct, and it doesn't always work. And that's where I think a lot of these confusions come from, So in the same fashion, the two Earths concept. So the two Earths concept is a purely third dimensional concept. I know people would disagree with that idea, but when you're looking at the Earth as splitting into two physical Earths, where some human beings are going to live on one and some are living on another, that's a purely third dimensional concept. So we're taking a third dimensional physical Earth idea and we're trying to raise it to a fifth dimensional, multi-dimensional perspective, and in the process we're creating stories that can't work because the laws don't apply the same way. But if we look at things realistically for a moment and think, are we really going to see our family members and friends disappear, vanish in front of us off the Earth, and then they're going to be somewhere else and we're going to be here? Or maybe they pass away from whatever illnesses and they're going to disappear and go live on another Earth. From a practical perspective, we know that can't happen, right? In the reality that we're living now. And what happens to all of our third dimensional friends and family members? Are they going to see us disappear from in front of them and vanish one day? That is not, I think, practical. So we have to understand that the idea of two physical Earths is a physical concept, a third dimensional concept. Whereas the actual way that it works is like the guides talked about in the recent Channel Revelation show, where it's really, we're both coexisting in the same reality. We may be walking together down the street, right? And maybe we are fifth dimensional and the person next to us is third dimensional, but they don't really care about us. And we don't really care about them in the sense that we don't feel the urge to talk to them. They don't feel like the urge to talk to us. It's almost like we're walking together on the street, but neither of us lives in each other's worlds. We don't acknowledge each other's existence in any meaningful way. We're just walking down the street. So in that sense, they're living in the third dimension. We're living in a fifth dimension. We may be thinking about fifth dimensional concepts and the interaction of all these things together and 13 dimensions and all these things and watching shows like this. And they may be thinking about practical things like, physical things like going to their job and doing whatever work they do, which is probably a very physical third dimensional job, and going home to their family and tending to their garden and things like that. So in their minds, they may be having these conversations. In our minds, while we're walking, we may be thinking about these multidimensional concepts. Meanwhile, we're walking on the same sidewalk. So I think it's more like that, where our family members are not going to vanish from our reality. They are still going to be there. And occasionally, we're going to have to step into the third dimension to go visit with them, meaning we'll go to their houses, right? And it's just like the guides talked about recently, like if I brought a handyman into this room, the handyman would see it as flat. That person wouldn't perceive the multidimensional aspects of the artwork on the walls and the energy of the space. They would just see everything that's flat. And if we were to go to their house or whatever reality, workplace, it would look very flat. It would have a lot of flat kind of ideas. They wouldn't have things like the flower of life on that wall because they're perceiving reality from a very third dimensional perspective. And yet we both coexist in the same reality. And maybe occasionally I have to go visit that person's reality and walk in the third dimension with them, even though in my space I'm carrying a fifth dimensional vibration. But their reality may be very third dimensional. It's sort of like if you have to go to a government office, right, to renew your license or something like that. That's a very third dimensional space. And the people there are mostly experiencing a very third dimensional reality. And the whole idea of licensing is a third dimensional concept. Yet most of us who drive cars have licenses, even though some of us know better, we still participate in those third dimensional things. It doesn't mean that tomorrow the earth is going to split and the Secretary of State is going to go away. It means that those things will still exist, and we will participate in them when we need to or when we have to. Maybe Thanksgiving comes up and we have to go to our family events, and it's a very third dimensional space, but we will visit those things when we need to, and we'll interact with those people in a third dimensional way. The difference might be you'll go to this event and maybe you'll have nothing to say to anybody, and they won't have much of anything to say to you except for trivial kind of things that are more third dimensional, whereas your mind is weighing out all these multidimensional ideas and you wish you could talk to everybody about it, but if you were to do it, probably nobody would understand what you're saying. So that is really how the two Earths are going to manifest. And it's not something that's someday happening. It already is happening. I think a lot of people are waiting for the split to occur, but the split is occurring now. And we know it's occurring now because you're having these experiences, right? You're going to your family events and you can't talk about anything. Or if you do, they don't understand you or they think you're crazy. And meanwhile, the conversations around the table can be very third dimensional in nature. And while you understand what they're saying, you may not really feel engaged or interested in participating in those things. Or you may do it just to make conversation. And that's the difference. That's what this split of Earth is going to look like. It's already there. It's just going to become more and more obvious, I think, with time, that divergence between those two groups of people. You experience it with your family. I do as well. I don't really interact with a lot of people outside of these communities these days. But when I occasionally do have to be around more third dimensionally oriented people, I pretty much don't talk about anything that's multidimensional in nature. I bring things to a third dimensional level, and mostly for me that's small talk, basic things, right? And on rare, as we've joked about this before, in Micheila's parents, at least she can carry on a conversation with them about these topics. They may not know what she's talking about, but at least they'll entertain it and they have some concept of it. But if I tell my mother, who's still alive, about these things, she says absolutely nothing. And at first I thought I couldn't quite figure it out, but I understood later on. It's just that these ideas, or the life that I live, even the third dimensional aspects of the life that I live, like this physical room and the studio, are so foreign to her reality that she doesn't even know what to say. It's almost as if the language I'm speaking is foreign. And so she has no understanding of what I just said. And so that's the split of timelines. That is the two Earths. It is people who are on the third dimension, very much like my family, who, if I said anything to them of anything that I experience in my life, even the physical aspects of it, to them, it is so far out of third dimension that they cannot conceive of an idea to respond. And so to them, it's either weird or it's just inconceivable or incomprehensible. And this is what the third to fifth dimensional split is looking like already. And so I don't think anybody needs to worry about suddenly tomorrow our family members are going to vanish off the earth and we'll never see them again. It's more like they vanished in the sense that they don't live in the same reality as we live. And so we can't have the same conversations with them that maybe, like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I could have a third dimensional conversation, even though I was exploring these ideas in the spiritual space. I was still mostly walking in the third dimension. And whereas the farther I go in the opposite direction, and it's harder and harder to communicate with people like my family, for example, who I can have very basic conversations, third dimensional conversations with, but not these multidimensional concepts.
Yeah, I think this is happening in varying degrees. I mean, obviously, this has been a very painful thing for some people in families, especially over the last couple of years. And that split of timelines is going right through relationships, intimate relationships as well, as we've talked about. But I want to play on to a couple of things that you said here. For example, we talk about third dimensional systems coming down, and how is that going to happen? It's not going to happen overnight. But I found myself running an errand for a family member last week, and I stopped at a local drugstore, pharmacy, right, convenience store kind of chain place that I would have frequented before all of the time, but I hadn't had any reason to go in there. And I was looking around at all of the products and the, things that the store carried. And I thought, wow, there is absolutely nothing in this store that I personally need to purchase. And I think that's how it's going to happen. So we're going to find this breakdown of these large chain stores and more conventional settings because people are awakening out of some of these things that, we really are leading a lifestyle that they don't fit into anymore. And I think the same thing could actually happen with the Secretary of State, because, I mean, those of us in these circles know that the requirements that we are asked to fulfill aren't truly requirements at all. So the more people that don't necessarily follow that path, the less will need those things, and they may tend to fall apart. But the thing to keep considering is we are the ones who are creating that path. So a lot of channels, people, I mean, even ask me to prophesize about, how is this going to happen and what's going to happen? Well, nobody knows, because while we can look at the landscape currently and the guides can give us a lot of information vibrationally about what they think will happen, we are the ones through every choice that are navigating this timeline shift, and we are determining how fast or how slow it's going to happen. And with that, I think we also have to consider that we do have a built-in mechanism for how everything happens as a collective. For example, the solar flash is another big topic of conversation where, I've heard people talk about the fact that there's going to be this huge solar flash, this event, and it's going to change the earth in a day, and we're going to wake up the next day and everything's going to be completely different. Very controversial, but I have channeled the complete opposite. And what the guides say is if you can go back and look at what's been happening with the solar over the last, even since 2012, what's going on is the solar is moderating itself to our readiness to actually shift into that new dimension. So we're not really designed to have to go through these very quick, automatic, even catastrophic events. Those things are planned by others. Those things are typically signs of manipulation. We're actually structured to move through our soul's divine plan and our evolutionary path in a very comfortable and gradual way. And so what we're going to notice over the next several years with the energies and, solar, plasma, all of that stuff is they're going to continue to increase, which is good news, because if we're meeting lower vibrational timelines with higher vibrational consciousness, we're going to be able to handle the challenges that we're inevitably going to face, because we're already facing them. We can see some of the things that are coming. And it's important for us, I think, to physically prepare. We have to use the critical mind as well as our intuition and the guidance that we're getting to set into motion, all of the things that we think will be necessary to, smoothly sail, as we've mentioned, through the next several years. And I personally think between now and 2025, that's going to be one of the rockiest periods. And you might have a different perspective on that from astrology, only because I notice the patterns that my guides bring into personal sessions. So a lot of people come to me for one-on-one private sessions. And of course, everyone is here to do something, really big in the world. And the guides have been alluding to the next several years being a really rapid and chaotic kind of transition, more towards the fifth dimension. But in order to do that, remember, systems are going to break down. So a lot of the things we've relied on in the third dimension that have been very convenient for us may either be more controlled, harder to work with, or not available at all. And so this is what Ethann and I have been, looking forward to and preparing for in our personal lives. And I think that's where a lot of the questions actually come in for us is, what are we doing? How are we perceiving this time on planet Earth? And, what choices are we making?
And of course, Bill Gates just got approval to darken the sun, right? And I think with it's very timely under the circumstances, right? And so I think whether they consciously know it or not, these individuals who control the world are aware of these factors happening in the world. And as in recent channel revelation shows, we've talked about how these themes are playing out again through the different things that they're doing. And you mentioned the flood, the Great Flood, and how it's happening in more micro experiences on the planet today. And that's encompassed in all of this. I mean, there's weather modification taking place right now. All the world's governments have weather modification technology. So much of the weather conditions we're seeing around the world today are artificial. And they're doing things like spraying chemicals in the air, or even in recent months, they started some sort of chemical fire in Canada that was blowing across Michigan, and they were saying it's just wildfires, but there's enough evidence to show that it wasn't a wildfire. Plus, the testing equipment I have here was showing different kinds of chemicals, so it wasn't really a wildfire as we would, see a forest fire type of chemicals show up. So they're doing all these kinds of experiments to modify people's behavior and to under the guise of global warming or climate change, right? And that's the umbrella under which they're using to cause fear in people to usher in all of these control systems, which are very much like during the Great Flood, except they're happening in smaller bits, right? And for those of you who may follow what's happening in China, as Micheila mentioned, they have lots of major flooding in many of their cities right now, and because the dams, they've released the water in the dams due to rainfall, and as a result, many of the cities and villages there are underwater, and the people are suffering immensely. So you're seeing little pockets of those kinds of things, and ultimately, if we go back to the Great Flood story, which was a lot of the population of the world was reduced because and we're going to get into this more in future shows, but a lot of the population of the world was reduced, and I think that same mindset still exists today in the minds of the world leaders, and their the whole population reduction program that people like Bill Gates are involved in is still prevalent today. So it's the exact same thing that happened in ancient times during the Great Flood, which is happening today, except it's happening in pockets throughout the planet in less severe ways. We're not seeing a global flood, but we're seeing little micro impacts here and there, such as he's darkening the sun, which, as we've seen, if you looked at the data, when their idea is to reduce the temperature, or at least was what they're saying, in doing, and also reduce the carbon dioxide. But if we look back historically through to thousands of years or tens or even millions of years ago, whenever CO2 levels were reduced, there was less human life. So human life exists in this range of CO2 levels. So obviously, if they succeed in reducing CO2, there's going to be few of us on the planet. So, and we're seeing that through vaccine proliferation, chemtrails, 5G, everything, right? So I think a lot of people are getting hung up on the Great Flood being about a flood, as opposed to it was about population reduction.
Yes.
Right? And the flood was just a way through which it was done, where today we're not going to see a flood that submerges the entire planet. But we are seeing vaccines, we're seeing 5G, we're seeing the darkening of the sun, we're seeing CO2 reduction programs that are that are going to, so all these things together, and people are more sick now as a result of all these things that have occurred in recent years. And so the end result is still the same: population reduction. There are fewer children getting married, or young adults getting married and having children of their own. Your kids, for example, are in that generation, and that generation, they don't want to have kids. So we're seeing in China also, they don't want to have kids because the Chinese people are suffering so greatly right now. They don't want to bring kids into the world, and many of them don't have money. They've lost their homes, and so we're seeing the same thing. So the Great Flood, I don't think, is about the flood. The flood was just the means through which reduced population was achieved for the same reason as it was back then, which is the gods who ruled the world at that time couldn't control the people because the people were proliferating too much and getting too powerful and becoming too smart, and they needed to reduce the population. The same agenda exists today in this situation, but it's not necessarily a global flood, right? It's a lot of little things. So that's what I get from all these things that we pay attention to.
Yeah, and that can sound pretty scary to those who are watching because, what do you do about all of that? But again, we have to keep in mind that we're revisiting history with new characters, new, stages, new, techniques and technologies. It's just a revisiting of something extremely important for us to awaken to and create something different. So we have to address fear, number one, because if we're going about this from fear, we're going to end up in the same exact timeline that we've been on since that great flood and even before, because that's what that timeline experience is truly all about. It's about a collective being controlled and in so much fear that they are dominated and are restricted in their ability to live freely. So the only solution to that is that we get out of the fear and we live freely anyway. And I know that's not an easy thing for everyone to do at this point in time on the planet, but I think you have to take everything, little by little and address it one thing at a time. But also what you're saying, it leans into another question I get and something that the guides talk about a lot, which is a very great migration of people over the next several years. And I think this will be, for me, one of the highlights of going through this very chaotic period is that there's an intelligence to the process. So whenever there is a problem, the guides say it's born of the solution because it's somehow moving us in the right direction. So even though these things exist and even though they seem to be getting worse, they can actually be a navigation for us to move to something better at a time on the planet when, we are the solution. We are the ones who are building that fifth dimension. So when the guides refer to this great migration, it comes from various standpoints. We alluded a little bit to government consolidation. So right now we're in this tug of war between this consolidated world government and decentralization, which is, I believe, where we're going to end up and where we want to be anyway. And so we can already see this playing out. A number of years ago, the guides came in and told me, for example, here in the United States, that we would see each state actually rising up into its own mini country, meaning every state was going to break somewhat away from the union and start doing their own thing because of the very tight restrictions, right? And so states have been here in the United States completely different. I mean, we've even had Florida, for example, adopting a law about central bank digital currency and not allowing that to be a part of their financial system. So this is going to be more the norm as we walk through the next several years. Is we're going to see smaller states, communities coming up with their own set of rules. And some of those might be very third dimensional. There are people out there who might want a central bank digital currency. And there will be places for those people to go. And there will be places where there will be more freedom. And so because of that, the guides say we're going to see this mass migration, which is actually leading to what they call cosmic family reunions, which is, highly conscious people now magnetizing and reuniting with their tribes. And this could be for a myriad of reasons. It could be for, to find organic food or more resources or better supplies, or because of weather events. So even though these things are playing out, I think ultimately what they're doing is they're moving people around to find new family and find new community and build those fifth dimensional timelines in their own geographic regions or new ones. However, the guide said this wouldn't pan out for another couple of years. So people are asking me all the time, is it a good time to move? Where do you go? Where do the guides say is good to go? The guides say, we don't know yet because we're all creating it. We're co-creating it together. So they can't prophesize and say, well, Europe is going to be the place to go where all the freedom is going to be, or Colorado we see as, one of the best places to go. They say, wait and see. Right now is a time for exploration, research, but not necessarily a time to place an anchor anywhere in ground. So what I've decided, and I know, what we're doing is we're really just kind of staying put and observing what's going on in the world and what's going on in various parts of the world that either we prefer or we think, well, that's certainly not going to be for us. But we have to keep in mind that could change in a moment's notice, because we're going to see a lot of shuffling around of world leaders. There's going to be a lot of changes going on in, the financial system and all of that. So hanging back and getting really comfortable where you are has been a recommendation of the guides, and in setting yourself up for success. So Ethann and I aren't necessarily preppers, and I don't even like that word because to me, unless you really love to do that, and there are people out there that love to do that, it typically comes from a fearful place. But I think setting up your home to be very simple and efficient, and to have the things on hand that you use and you need at a time when we might not have them readily available at our fingertips is a really good place to focus. And, we do that in many different areas.
Yeah, I think in terms of, where to move, it's going to be, I follow some people on YouTube. I watch innumerable different kinds of videos in my research and in my own personal interests, from financial markets and to archaeology and such. And over the past few years, some of those YouTubers have traveled from place to place. They've moved to another country because it was less dystopian than in the US. And then all of a sudden, the place where they moved became very dystopian. They had to move from there back to the US. And I think that's the problem. Between now, I would say, at least until the very end of this decade, it's not, unless you love traveling, and that's just something you do for fun, it's not going to be easy to determine where is a good place to live based on your own values and your vibration, because it may be great where you are now, and then by next year it may not be so great. So I think the best thing to do is to find some place you like living, where you feel comfortable, and stay there. And if you don't feel comfortable there, then move somewhere you do feel comfortable. And it's not really, in terms of the external, three-dimensional location of where you live, it's not going to be easy to determine which areas are going to resonate with you just yet, because all those things will be up in the air for a little while. So, what we do really more is to cultivate our inner reality, and which means creating an environment where you feel happy and content and fulfilled. It doesn't really matter what's going on out there. Let people out there do what they do, and let them live their lives however they want. It doesn't have to impact you. And I think the idea about prepping what we don't like about the idea about prepping is what you mentioned, is because conventionally the idea of prepping is a fear-based idea. It is the fear that everything in the world is going to go south, and as a result, south meaning negative, and as a result, we're going to be stuck in an uncomfortable place, either not have enough food or, as recent years, toilet paper, whatever. We're going to see these kinds of things in different parts of the world, and we have no control over those things. But I don't think prepping, because if I look back over my life, even when I was 20 years old, people were talking about the end of the world is coming.
Yes.
And I had a friend back then who I was in business with, and he had bought like a few years worth of military rations, that you can keep in a box for years, and he kept those for a few years because he knew for sure the world was coming to an end very soon, and he would need them. But a few years later, well, they were all expiring, so he just ate them. And that's what I think has been happening for the last 30 years, at least in my observation. People have been preparing for the end of the world, and yet they end up eating their MREs because, well, they're expiring anyway. I think that's the thing, is if you are a prepper because you love doing it, then I don't see any problem. Prep all you want. But if you're a prepper because you're afraid that the world's going to come to an end and you're going to be in trouble, then I think that's not a good basis for doing that. I mean, for us, I always say, have 6 months worth of supplies of whatever you normally use, not because the world's going to come to an end and there's going to be a shortage, but more because things are going to be a little bit in flux for a while. And so just to create a buffer between you and global insanity, I think it's just smart to have a little extra of what you normally use. So maybe there's a shortage of toilet paper or eggs or something for a few months. Well, if you have a little extra of whatever you need, then you can let the world do what it needs to do, and it has no impact on you and your experience. I think it should be treated more like that, more like an opportunity to just sort of create a buffer and a comfortable space to be in, not to prepare because you're afraid that you're going to starve to death. Because I think fear is the underlying issue here. Because, we talk about these subjects and I touch on a lot of topics that scare a lot of people. But for me, it's not a fear-based thing. For me, it's really, it's something interesting and fascinating and whatever. And I think fear is the biggest issue here. Is if we allow ourselves to go into fear, we make choices that are not healthy choices. And, we may hoard toilet paper because we're afraid that it's going to run out. And then all of a sudden the toilet paper shortage is over and we've got 2 years worth of toilet paper stocked up, right? And I think that's the thing that we have to understand, is there are going to be a lot of artificial shortages created that are being created partly because certain companies want to make money, and partly just to scare the people and keep us in control. The more we're in fear, the more we're controlled. And but I think if you use things on a regular basis, it's not a bad idea to have a 6-month cushion, just so that you can ride out the fluctuations in the market, right?
Yeah.
I look at it from a practical sort of market perspective, because even if you look at any market, whether it's a commodity market or a stock market or whatever, there are fluctuations in the market. Sometimes it's high, next day it crashes, and then sometimes it's high, and next year it crashes. But if you are prepared for those ups and downs, then you have a smoother ride. It's not really you're afraid that it's going to crash, but you're set up in such a way that it can do whatever it wants, the world can be insane or whatever, and it has very little impact on your life. And that's kind of how we set up our lives, is just to prepare the essentials so that we can keep doing our work and we can keep living our lives, and the world out there can do whatever it does. And with regard to even supplements, as we talked about before, we've talked about some things, in the last few years, N-acetylcysteine, for example. Now, there was a ban on N-acetylcysteine during the whole virus situation, and now it's not banned anymore. But, we had enough in stock that it didn't affect us at all. So we just continued on our lives. Another thing that we kept was methylene blue, which is also been used for treating different kinds of illnesses and viruses and things like that, and even in hospitals it's used, and that also is has been used. I was just listening to a book about how they used it on, I think, around 2,000 people over the last few years, and none of them tested positive. Not that I'm saying is that the test is actually testing anything, but the reality is that none of those people showed any symptoms or any test results that showed them as being positive for the virus that was going around. And so these tools are available to us, and I think those are things we can just keep in stock so that the world out there can be insane and we can ride through it just like we did last few years. We didn't get sick. I mean, I didn't even have a sniffle over the last few years, and I don't think you got sick either, right? And I don't know about Barb as much, but I assume she's been fine as well. And this is what prepping is about, is just having those things so that you can be comfortable and maintain your life and be happy and fulfilled, and not in a state of fear, stocking up because you might starve to death or die of a virus.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue, well, several big issues with food, first of all, is like we have to pay extra attention now because there are new things coming into the food supply that we've never had to look for before. And we've gotten pretty savvy as conscious people as to what to weed out. But unfortunately, we have to be really on our toes, I think, even with organic products and things these days, because there's so many buyouts of these companies, by large corporations that don't have the best intentions. And then Ethan and I have talked a lot about food in terms of availability, but he and I believe that the biggest issue is going to be cost, and we can see that with inflation and all that's happening. So it makes sense to buy ahead and in quantity, shelf ready things that you actually use in the house. And, he and I do that all of the time. But the other thing that we have to consider is just, we keep going back to fear, but I want to bring this into the food situation because it's really hard right now to know what sources to trust. And there are a lot of them out there. And I, you certainly do your research in various areas, and I do my own, and we cross over in some of that. But if there's one thing that I've learned over the last couple of years, unfortunately, it's that I don't 100% trust the news of anybody because unfortunately, well, first of all, nobody really knows. We're all making a prediction based on what we see. And I do think there have been people planted even in the alternative media sources to create fear amongst those of us who do see what's going on. So we really have to touch in, to how the information is being presented, but also get it from multiple sources and then step back and very calmly and rationally make our own determination, which I know is really hard in a situation like this because, everyone wants to know what everyone else is doing and what's the best path to take. And I don't know if there is any one best path to take because, we're all unique individuals with unique needs. And when we're facing a situation with so many inconsistencies and instabilities as we walk into the future, we really have to tune into our priorities, and we have to know within our guts and within our hearts what is our truth. So for me, if it's prophesizing in a very fearful way, or if there are a lot of theatrics involved, I tend to step back and put a lot of caution in the way of trusting that source. And I just take what resonates with me. As a matter of fact, if I feel like there are too many news sources predicting doom, I'll just step away for a while. You're much better at tuning into that stuff than I am, but I know that will affect my vibration. And when my vibration is affected or my emotional body is affected, when I'm way out into the future, it's not the right time for me to make rational decisions about food shortages or the financial system, planning ahead for anything. So that's a time when I shut it down. I think we all need to be thinking about, that, because we're going to see a lot more uncovered over the next several years. And, we even talked in I think it was our last podcast, maybe the one before that, about spiritual teachers that, we followed that came out, talking about depopulation and, on the side of the vaccine, we would have never considered that those people would have done that. But we see now very clearly that a lot of these people with big followings, they have other interests, unfortunately, in mind. So we have to be taking care of ourselves and then also taking care of each other. And, the whole idea of community comes into this. And we talked a little bit, I know, in past podcasts about going to the source. So I think we're being really challenged right now as to the idea of what our true source is in many different ways. So going to the source, whether it's the farmer or the manufacturer, beyond the big chains, right, and the middlemen, I think that's what we want moving into the fifth dimension. And it's helping us to create those really stable networks that can get us through in very challenging times. Because if there's any corruption, we know it's going to be at the level of, the top echelon companies, right? The big companies that'll buy into all of that and play along. So we're going for making relationships with people that we can trust and building those relationships into a community or a network so that we can serve each other.
I can say that I'm very confident that there's not going to be a global food shortage, in the sense that you're not going to be able to get anything to eat, right? That's not going to happen. That doesn't mean that in isolated areas that may not happen. That there may be pockets around the world where that'll happen, but it won't happen in a global way. So, for example, in the United States where we are, I don't expect a food shortage all across the United States where there's not going to be anything available. But there will be pockets, and there will be specific products. So like in the last few years, eggs had a shortage, right? And so it was very hard to get eggs, but it wasn't impossible to get eggs. The only problem was they were getting ridiculously expensive. And I think that's more likely the case of what's going to happen. So if you have money, and the money that you have is outside of the system, meaning not in actual dollars, like maybe cryptocurrency, maybe some in dollars, then I think you can ride this out just fine. You just may end up paying a lot more for the food that you buy now. Already most of you are noticing, especially if you're in Western countries and you're buying food at grocery stores, you're noticing that the food you're buying is twice or three times as much as it was just a few years ago, and the quantities and the packaging in some cases are much less. So that's where I see the food issue going to be is in reduction of quantity and quality, and also extremely high prices. And we've only started seeing the beginning of that in terms of the price. So if you have money, and especially money outside of the system that you can move into and out of the system when necessary to pay for things, then you'll be fine. For everyone else, you have to find a way that works for you so that you can ride this out. And that may be growing your own food, or it may be making friends with a farmer, or volunteering your time there for food, or whatever. We all, there's no reason for anyone to suffer. It's just we may have to make adjustments, and as I always say, make inconvenient choices to put ourselves in situations during this time to where we can skate right through it with no problems, and even come out of it with a lot of great experiences and joy. So the problem is that we tend to get sort of situated in a particular way of doing things and don't want to let go, and the fear comes with the letting go, when in fact, if we let go and moved in a new direction that may be inconvenient, it may take us into thriving in that area. And so I think with food, I'm not worried about that in terms of shortages. But as you've seen in any kind of inflationary situation in the world over the history of, we've had money on the planet, or some form of money. So last 10,000 years or so, when inflation occurs, food becomes more expensive. It doesn't usually go away entirely. So, I think now in the US economy is an important factor there. And even if you're not living in the US right now, it's going to impact you because the US is still the largest consumer economy in the world. And at the moment, the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. And so long as it is, what happens in the US is going to impact the global financial system and everybody's economy and inflation everywhere. So if the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it's going to affect the global financial situation, and inflation will occur everywhere. It'll occur everywhere else faster than in the U.S. So if inflation happens here, it's going to happen worse in most other countries. So, for those who may not understand the macroeconomic picture, this is an area of interest of mine. One thing to just look ahead to, and I see this in the cycles as well, is I believe there's a Saturn-Neptune influence coming up over the next few years, or maybe it's starting next year. I can't recall. Sometime in the next few years. And, well, that's, Saturn-Neptune oftentimes can coincide with depression periods, depression area, like emotional depression, feelings of hopelessness, sadness, that sort of thing. And well, in the U.S. financial system right now, our government here is spending a ridiculous amount of money every year, and every year they're spending more. And well, they're not getting that money from taxes because they're spending so much now that even with the amount they're bringing in taxes, they are not bringing in enough to offset their spending. And of course, it's that spending that they're doing that they're using to create all these dystopian things that we're all dealing with in the world today. Like Bill Gates wouldn't be able to darken the sun if our government wasn't financing these things. And the vaccine companies wouldn't succeed if our government wasn't buying the vaccines. So all the spending is going to all of these dystopian things that are causing suffering on the planet. But what's happening is their spending continues to increase every year. And because the Federal Reserve Bank here in the U.S. is continuing to raise interest rates, the cost of, because they're not making the money in taxes, so the difference is being made up in borrowing more money. So the government keeps borrowing more money every year at a higher and higher interest rate. And within the next year to 2 years, they're going to hit a wall with that, meaning the interest payments will be so high that there will be no way for them to keep up with it. So sometime in the next 2 years, we're going to see some sort of financial governmental disaster occur that results in the government not being able to spend as much as they could before without severe consequences. Now, that may result in them printing more currency or issuing more currency on the Federal Reserve level, or it may they may absorb the Federal Reserve into the U.S. Treasury so they can continue printing money. Hard to say, but regardless, the consequences will be extreme inflation and a financial depression that will come on the other side of that. So this is what we're heading into. Now, that sounds very gloom and doom and scary, but the positive side of it is they won't be able to spend as much money on all of this ridiculousness. And so this decade, they're going to keep pushing and spending more money so they can continue bringing out these dystopian things. But when they run out of money, the consequence at some point will be they will no longer be able to finance all these programs. And when they can no longer finance them, they're going to start falling apart. We're starting to see the early stages of that already. So on the negative side, that kind of a governmental financial collapse is going to affect all of us. So we have to do our best to insulate ourselves from those external occurrences by having some of our money outside of the system, not in dollars, and preparing to ride out any turbulence in the global system. But the positive side of this is just the fire that we have to walk through so that we can come to the other side, because it's actually a necessary thing. If everything was left as it is and the economy didn't collapse, then the government would keep spending more money and keep rolling out more control mechanisms and darkening the sun and all these things. I think by the early next decade, we're going to see, the last 20 years, as I've said, I was sun gazing 20 years ago, or actually prior to 2000, and the skies were clear and blue all the time. Nowadays, it's rare to see that, right? And more, and now it's gotten to a point where they're admitting that they're spraying chemicals. Where over the last 20 years, we were conspiracy theorists.
Yes, we were the crazy ones. Sorry.
We were crazy for
Yeah.
saying they're spraying chemicals.
Yeah.
But now the government is coming out and saying, "Oh, well, we're going to spray chemicals and to darken the sun," and everybody thinks that's normal, right? But we were nuts until now, and but what I think is going to happen is this financial catastrophe that's coming on the governmental level is going to result in them no longer having the funds to do these kind of things. So in the next decade, we may start to see chemtrails go away. Finally, after 20 years, right? So we may see those kinds of dystopian things, control systems, and even we were just talking the other day about the world coin currency, which is they created this little eyeball scanning thing, and there are some 2 million people who already had their iris scanned, so they can get $1 a week in universal basic income. So things like that. Very dystopian, very control system oriented, social credit are going to come out. But the positive is, and this is where we need to look at these dystopian things and see the positive. The positive is that company's projection, and of course they're World Economic Forum or company, right? They're associated with them. And it's the founder of this system is the same guy who founded ChatGPT, or the OpenAI system, which is everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people are using. And but the positive is the company's projection was that they were going to have 100 million people's irises scanned by now, and they've only managed to get 2 million. And this is where I think the world is heading in the right direction, because even though they're rolling these things out, it's not getting the adoption they want. And ultimately that's showing that consciousness is starting to expand. People are starting to see the truth, and they're making better choices as a result. And I think a lot of these programs will just lose favor and will go broke. And as they go broke, they'll stop putting them out. And they'll start changing their approach, because otherwise, they're not going to be able to succeed anyway. So that's where I think we have to sort of keep our minds at riding out the storm ahead. It's a necessary storm, because as a result, it's going to get rid of all of this difficult stuff that we're dealing with on the planet. But meanwhile, we're going to have to observe it happening out there outside of our, outside of our doors and windows, and be able to navigate through that time.
And I think we also have to keep in mind that with all this dystopian stuff, whether it's social credit, smart cities, a CBDC, surveillance, all this stuff, there is an illusion of no choice. And that's what they did with the vaccine. So if we go back to, the pandemic period, where if you were not vaccinated, you couldn't enter a store, or you had to get your temperature scanned, or you couldn't get on a plane. You had to wear a mask at the doctor's office. There was the illusion that you had to follow all of these rigid requirements in order to live your life. And that is a very third dimensional reflection of the timeline. But what I found, and you found, and I know many others found, is that there are many options beyond that. So I was not interested in having my temperature scanned and wearing a mask. I certainly was not going to get the vaccine. So I had to shift my life in many different directions, change the stores that I went to, change the way that I shopped, find new doctors or practitioners to go to that were on the same side in terms of my beliefs and free will choice. And I believe that when we get to this next level, which we inevitably will, the same thing will be the case. It's each step is pushing us to realize how much freedom we actually have, And sometimes that freedom is in saying no. We didn't travel during that time. We chose not to get on a plane because unless we were going to charter our own, which is quite expensive, there's no real way around that. But I think in order for us to realize our freedom, sometimes the choice is either yes or no, and there's no in between. And by saying no and not contributing to these, very restrictive experiences, we are furthering that opportunity to jump timelines into the fifth dimension. It truly is that simple, even though it's an annoyance. And I don't think we would be challenged or facing these challenges if we were not the people who could handle it or who were resourceful enough to find new things, new paths, new avenues to get the things that we need or to do the things that we do. And for us, that was setting up our homes in very efficient ways. For me, it was bringing in equipment and things that I needed to ensure my house, so I didn't have to run into any of that stuff. But those will be things that we will do again. And as we do it, we're going to find ourselves in a completely different reality. Because, on top of even inflation, the idea of inflation, we have to consider there's going to be carbon tax, right, on top of that. And so if we're trying to make it in the conventional world without some foot into the alternative world, I think it's going to be really hard. And that's where we have to, manage both sides. And you mentioned very briefly about alternative currencies, and having some of those. And you and I have been invested for quite a while in, cryptocurrencies. And we talked about that, in past shows. We get the question a lot of times about that. Is it malevolent, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies? I guess at the moment, we don't know. But we also know that the dollar is probably the most malevolent of them all. So it's a question between one or the other. In my mind, it's just having an alternative. And that's what I believe it's all about is, we're bringing in some really good alternatives to what was before. And whether or not those alternatives are the absolute best for us and what we truly want at the end of the day, they're a stepping stone on that path. So I think that's the ease we can put into the equation is, yeah, there could be a lot of really scary things that we'll have to deal with, challenging things that get in our way, but we really have to simplify, take them day by day and one thing at a time, be willing to stretch the bounds of the norm to find the things that we need.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about not being too dogmatic about our ideas, especially during this time, because we're going to have to be flexible to try new things. And with regard to cryptocurrency, I know a lot of people think that Bitcoin is evil or it was started by the cabal, and maybe those things are true. We don't know who started Bitcoin, really. I mean, the founder is mysterious. It could very well have been DARPA, just like DARPA started the internet. It could be. We don't know. Maybe someday we will know. But, and there are some suspicions on who it might have been or what group of people it might have been, but we don't really know for sure yet. And so we can get caught in the woods with those ideas and get stuck in the dogma of that belief and not look at the practicality of the situation, because the dollar is probably the most evil currency on the planet. Mm-hmm. And there's more, in a lot of the mainstream media, they talk about how Bitcoin is evil and it's being used for money laundering and it's highly inefficient and it's using more electricity than entire countries. All of that is false. In fact, Bitcoin uses very little energy, and a lot of it is becoming more and more sustainable energies like solar and things like that. So it really isn't, for the amount of value that it produces, the amount of energy used is minimal compared to other systems like Visa, MasterCard, for example, use much more energy if you consider the infrastructure that it takes to run that financial system. And in terms of money laundering, Bitcoin is a fraction of a percent of the money laundering that happens in the world. All the rest of it, the majority of the rest of it is the US dollar. So again, these are all dogmas that we buy into in our media. But at the end of the day, you have to look at practicality, because if you're saying Bitcoin is evil, therefore I shouldn't use it, well, you should be saying the same about the dollar. So unless you're living completely off the grid in the woods and off the land, and you require no means of interface with the third dimensional financial system, where you don't need any currency, then you're going to have to use some kind of currency. And in that landscape of all the currencies available, Bitcoin may be the least evil, in the sense that at least what we do know about it is it's not controlled directly, anyway, by any central banks or governments. Now, it doesn't mean that governments can't buy a lot of it and manipulate the markets. Certainly they can do that. And since governments have the ability to print infinite amounts of currency, in theory, they could print as much US dollar or whatever currency they want and buy Bitcoin with it. So that is certainly a possibility. But there is no Federal Reserve Bank of Bitcoin that can print more Bitcoin tomorrow. So in the very least, from a purely technical perspective, we can say that Bitcoin, I'm not talking about all cryptocurrencies, but Bitcoin as an example, is a more fair and free currency than any other currency that exists on the planet today. So because there is no issuer, there is no control system behind it, and it'd be very hard, if not impossible, to manipulate in any meaningful way to where it would become unfair to people on the planet. So, for all practical purposes, if we're going to live in this third to fifth dimensional reality where we need some sort of currency to function and buy things and such, we're going to need something. And in that world, Bitcoin is the most fair and benevolent currency today. Is it completely benevolent? No, because I think the people who hold the most Bitcoin in the planet are the most malevolent people in many cases. For example, the US government holds a lot of Bitcoin, actually, all of which they confiscated from other people. But nonetheless, they are holding it and selling it off periodically. So the government may be malevolent, but it doesn't make the currency malevolent. And they can print more of it if they want to. So we have to look at it from a practical standpoint. And the other thing to consider is, if a central bank's digital currency with a social credit system comes into being to where you can't buy the things you need unless the government says you can, or unless you behave a certain way, then having a currency outside of that system may be beneficial. Now, it's possible that all the on and off ramps may be closed, meaning there may come a time where maybe you won't be able to use your Bitcoin to buy things at a typical store, but it won't make the cryptocurrency go away. So it'll still be sitting there, and maybe you can exchange it with a farmer to buy some eggs or something, but you may not be able to go to your local grocery store and use it to buy groceries. But it would be wise, I think, to have some currency outside of the system, that if the system locks down, or your own bank account locks down, for example, because you watch our show, for example, and we're not saying things that are approved, then you have currency outside of the system. Now, if you are somebody who follows all of the mainstream things, and you follow the rules, and you live in that very controlled, rigid, third dimensional reality, then it may not matter, because maybe you'll follow all the rules, and as a result, you'll be able to skate through, even though your life will be very controlled by the system. But if you're like us, we're not really like that. We would rather be inconvenienced than to live a limited life. So we choose to live a more free and abundant life, and that's what we talk about here. And if you want to live that way in the world that we're in today, you may have to take these steps to do some things that may be less convenient, that will provide you with more freedom in the world today. Now, many people on the comments over the past several months in our videos have been saying there is no CBDC, but actually the central bank digital currency, the payment rails have just been put in place in the past month. And So the CBDC is already here in the US, and many countries have them completely in place. Now, the payment rails are there, but they haven't rolled it out in the US as something that we would be using yet. But it is being used between banks at the moment. So the next step will be to bring that out in a way for the retail customer, which would be us, whereas the institutions are using it now in the US. So it is here, and it is intended to be rolled out to the rest of us. Question is, how many people adopt it? And that's the thing that you were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly.
Same thing with the vaccine. I think ultimately, although the statistics that the government is saying are suggesting that so many people used the vaccine, I'm willing to bet they made those up.
Oh, for sure.
And because the adoption level wasn't as high as they wanted it to be. And as a result, it went away. Now they're going to keep trying, but I think what's going to happen is each new vaccine and virus they roll out is going to get less and less adoption. And as a result, they'll just stop trying because they'll fail and they'll just be wasting money. And I think the same will happen with the CBDC. It is coming, and it will be social credit based. But I think probably hardly anybody will use it. Just like the iris scanning technology that 2 million people signed up for. Yeah, maybe they'll get a few million people to use it, but I don't think it's going to work. So I think that's where we have to choose. We may be living in a dystopian world with a lot of dystopian things, but doesn't mean we have to live inside of there. We can let it be out there, and maybe we'll have to have a central bank digital currency account just so we can pay for certain things that may be required to pay for using it, but doesn't mean we have to live in that place. Just like maybe I have to go to the Secretary of State to get a license renewed every once in a while because I choose to participate in that third dimensional structure. But that doesn't mean I have to live in that third dimensional world. And I think in the same way, we have to treat everything in our lives right now. We may have to interface with that third dimension. We may have to go to the family events, but that doesn't mean that we live in that third dimensional world. I may have to speak with my mother or visit her, and in that reality, I can't really talk about how I see reality because she won't understand. But that doesn't mean I can't go there and do what I need to do in that reality. And that's how I think we need to navigate this time is we may have to participate in some of those things just because we're walking between two worlds. But it doesn't mean we have to be of that reality, right? And that's where using these other opportunities, like, for me, I'm not suggesting anybody else should do this, but over the last few years, I switched to a privacy-based smartphone because I didn't want to be tracked. Now, is it convenient? No. Does it have all the frills that regular smartphones have? No, but it's enough for me. I also switched from Windows to Linux, which is a bit of a clumsy transition and not easy for most people to make. But I did it because I wanted more privacy and I didn't want to be tracked and so on. And so these are some things. The opportunities are all there, right? And Aquarian Pluto is going to bring more opportunities for independence and freedom. But it's up to us to choose those things. Because meanwhile, the Pluto and Capricorn influence is still here. And those things are also going to be there to choose from. And we can either be free and independent and live in a more sovereign way, or we can be more enslaved. And I think that's an opportunity and a choice that we all will have this decade.
Yeah, I think there's so many other things we could add to this equation. Like I put solar on my house and, preparation of grid shutdowns and things like that. But these very things are what are moving us forcefully sometimes into the fifth dimension. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that we all signed up for it. We all agreed to be here during this incredible and fantastic transitional period on planet Earth to be the ambassadors of the new Earth. And we wouldn't have done that if we didn't have confidence in ourselves. I think that's a good place to wrap up this episode. Thanks for joining us today. And you can always catch us on multiple platforms: YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Apple. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Channeled Revelations.